Okay, so very important concept that needs to be taken care and discussed in developing the web API is the problem that arises when consumer of the service doesn't know how to reach a certain part of API. So since there's no, like in web services, there's no UDDI to where you can see, okay, this does this does that. This is kind of ambiguous in a web API. So I mean, we are using IDs such as one or two in order to retrieve each food measure, but this is not known to the user, and it adds a large amount of ambiguity to it. So in order to remove this, we need to include into each set of data which comes from the object that we're returning, we need to return the URL. So one of the ways that we could do this, and I will demonstrate in a second, is we could, in each of our models, we'll have to create a property for the URL or URI, whichever one we want, and then assign this type of link in our model factory. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. So in both food model and measure model, I created another property called URL, and then in our factory where we are building these models is where we can go ahead and assign the links to them. So here I assigned the URL string.format and then our localhost link, which kind of mimics our route, kind of, and then we just pass in the ID of the food, and we can do very similar with our URL for our measure model, except we're going to have two IDs here, and there's this one. So now if we run this, our collection of foods, will see that each one has a link now that shows exactly, you know, what's displaying. So for example, if you click on one of these, something is not working with something is not right with our link here. The link for this is actually foods, not food. So it should update to foods here. So now when we click on it, see, it will give us this and then also individual one. So it's working, but however, this is not a good way to do this, because when we hard code this link, if we change, especially if we change our route, then we have to change it all over the code, and then also localhost specific servers changes quite a bit. I mean, this can be a production server, testing server, so if you have to change it for your server, it's very painful to do. So in order to do this, we can use a special thing that we have in Web API, and that is a URL helper object. So in order to use a URL helper object, we're going to have to pass the request into our food model, into our constructor. And here we have to pass HTTP request I think message, I call it request, yes, system.net HTTP request message request, and then here we are going to have the URL helper that will take this request. It takes the request. Another very important thing here to do is to make sure that we use not the one from web.mvc, but to use the HTTP routing one. And then we can go ahead and generate a field. And this needs to go inside of the class, not inside of the method. Again. So we have now defined the request. Now with this URL helper, we can go ahead and build up our string, dynamic type of string here for each one of our models. So in order to do this, we will use our we'll say our URL is equal to our URL helper link. The name of our route, I think it's food, and then we say the dynamic part of it, which is a food dot ID in our case. No, actually no, we had to new up here. We had to new up our anonymous object, and then we had to say food equals food dot ID, I believe. Or food ID. That's the name of our link, is food ID in our. So that should actually build this dynamic link, and we need to do something similar down here, which is going to be a little bit different because it's a longer link, or URL. I don't know why I keep calling it a link. So we use URL helper dot link. Well, they call it link too, I guess. And then the name of this one right here is a measure. I believe it's a singular. Then we new up our anonymous object, and we say that food ID is equal to, since we only have a measure here, m.food.id, and our ID is the other one, is equal to m.id. Now when we try to build this, the problem is going to arise that we are not passing this request here, and this is, in order to be able to get this request, we have to do some tweaking, and the biggest thing that we have to do is we have to create a base for our controller, base class for our controller, and then in it we have to create deferred property for our for our model factory, because if we try to pass it here, it's going to try to pass the request that hasn't even been fully instantiated. So we need to defer creation of this until we actually have the request. In order to do this, we'll create another constructor, call it another controller, and call it base API controller. This controller has to take in from API controller, and some of the things that we got to do here are very similar like we do in our food controller. So we can go ahead and copy paste this and just change this to base API controller, because this constructor is base API controller constructor, and just add some references here. and then we need to factor this out. Oh, we can also make this public abstract class, so it can be instantiated. And then here, what we need to do is we need to create this deferred property, and we just created like this protected model factory, and we use get, and then we have this request, and then return the model factory. So public model factory, call it the model factory, and inside we have get, and then we say if model factory is null, model factory, we new it up with the request, and else we return model factory. So we effectively deferred the creation of this model factory until we have the request, and we can do the same here for our repository. So we do exactly the same thing for our repository. We call it the repository, and we're not deferring anything here. We're just, returning the actual repository back. So now we have defined our base API controller. So let's go to our food controller and inherit from it. So we are no longer going to be doing this part right here. We're getting rid of this. We won't need these. We are still going to be passing the repository, but we're going to be passing to our base. So just taking the repository, passing it into the base repository. Then these guys right here, we are not using this, we're using the, what do we call it here? Call it the repository from our base. And the same thing for our model factory, we call it the model factory. And we do the same thing for our measure controller, and I'll do that behind the scenes. So I did the same thing for our measures controller, so we should be pretty much ready to run this, and it should work now with our dynamic way of displaying these. So they're working exactly the same, except now all of these are generated based on our routes. We're not really generating them. We're not hard coding anything. These are, if we change the routes, if we change anything here, these will work just fine. So with a little bit of tweaking, we were able to get this crucial part of our functionality for our web API in which it sort of describes itself.